These are the techniques that you should know to get through an entire tattoo. Let's go. So firstly, this first technique is called Pendulum, and it's probably the go-to technique for most, if not all, black and grey artists. Pendulum technique involves moving in a pendulum motion, coming down, entering the skin, and then coming out, following that same path. It doesn't matter which direction you go, the technique is the same. This is used for smooth black and grey and is the jack of all, building up values, blending, saturation, blending colour. This is a technique you should be using. Using Pendulum, as long as your technique is the same throughout, you can go back and forth, left to right, diagonally, building up in the direction that you want. Next up, we've got whip shading. Now I tend to keep my voltage the same, whether that be for Pendulum or for whip. But whip shading involves entering the skin and pushing forward with just a little bit more hand speed. This creates a darker, more saturated look at the start of the whip and gradually gets lighter, creating a fade as you start to come out of the skin. You will see a lot of trad artists doing this movement, but don't be fooled. Colour realism artists and black and grey artists use it all the time. Now we have stipple shading. Stipple shading involved generally a liner needle, the most popular being a freeliner. Stipple involves bringing your voltage down to ensure your machine is running slow and using the whipping motion that you did for whip shading. The difference being is that you want the needle to bounce across the skin, creating dots, but also creating those dots further apart from each other. This technique is great for creating texture and I use it all the time. Then we have pepper shading. Now I still do call this stipple because the theory is the same, but the technique differs slightly. Still using a liner, for pepper shading you are bringing your voltage back up just slightly. That's because you want to still have that bounce, but we want our dots to be closer together. Once we have our machine set, we are going to fall back onto that pendulum motion. Now the needle that you use will affect the look of this slightly, so experiment with tapers and gauges to find what you like. I will say that when I am shading, whether that be stipple, pepper, whip or pendulum, my machine angle is somewhere between vertical and a 45-degree angle. Next up is a general line, a staple of tattooing. For this you need to bring your voltage up. The voltage I recommend will depend on the machine that you are using, but your manufacturer will have a voltage guide. So I always recommend just following that. But bring the angle of your machine to a more vertical position to ensure that you are keeping your depth even, and then pull your line. I do have a full lining guide, so please check that out after this. Be careful on the voltage you use, please take that into account for the liner you are using. Then we have line sculpting. Now this is also explained in my lining guide, but sculpting a line is any line that isn't a single pass. But sculpting can also be used for lines that you want to taper, for example, having a line that goes from thick to thin. This is a great method to use. Double lining I also class as sculpting. Now double lining is when you run a line, put another line next to it and fill the empty space, creating a thicker line. To be honest, I wouldn't do this. I would just use a bigger lining needle, but it is part and parcel of sculpting. Now this is something that you don't see very often, but I actually use this in almost every tattoo through sheer laziness alone, and that's lining with a Magnum needle. Now it doesn't matter what Magnum you have, that being curved or straight, etc., all these magnums can do it. Lining with a mag can be done two ways, and which way you use will be up to you and the piece that you are doing. Lining with a mag is great for when you want to just tighten things up, or when you need a line that you don't want to be so prominent. Lining with a mag is relatively easy. It will take a little bit of practice, but once you get it, it's very easy. With the voltage the same as your shading voltage, angle your machine so that you are able to work on the corner of your mag. Using that corner, enter the skin and pull your line just like you would any other line, trying to be consistent. I like to have more needle hang when doing this just for more control. Now we've learned how to line with a mag, let me show you what can be done, and this technique is used by script and geometric artists. And that's using a mag to create multiple lines in one go. To do this, bring your voltage up just slightly from your shading voltage, enter the skin at just above a 45-degree angle, and pull backwards towards you. Again, this will take some practice, so please do practice it first. Don't just go onto skin and, expect that you can do it. Finally, onto packing black, one of the hardest things to do. Check out this video for the full guide, but a brief explanation. Using the needle with a higher gauge and a shorter taper, enter the skin and make small circles. No bigger than the needle that you are using. That is really important. Staying tight, come one way, then the other way. And then if you want it to come from a direction you haven't, do that. But the most important thing to do is keep it methodical for the perfect black, and also be very, very wary of overworking.